All right. Good morning, everyone. This is a joint hearing of the Subcommittee on Research and the Subcommittee on Technology, and it will come to order. Welcome to today's joint hearing entitled The Current and Future Applications of Biometric Technologies. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. Before we get started, since this is a joint hearing involving two subcommittees, I want to explain how we will operate procedurally so all members understand how the question and answer session period will be handled. As always, we will alternate rounds of questioning between the majority and minority members. The chairman and ranking members of the Research and Technology subcommittees will be recognized first. Then we will recognize members present at the gavel in order of seniority on the full committee, and those coming in later after the gavel will be recognized in order of arrival. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on the current and future applications of biometric technologies. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony on how this technology is developing and the ways biometrics might better the lives of my constituents and every American. Many of us have been introduced to biometric technologies by the way of movies and TV shows, James Bond-style spy thrillers, and the ever-present mega vault secured with iris and palm scanners. While these examples portray a high-tech, futuristic technology that has little application to the average person, the reality is that biometric technologies have been utilized over the past 2 decades in many industries and fields. Whether being used to enhance security by controlling physical access to facilities or preventing fraud by controlling electronic access to computer networks, these practical applications affect everyone on an individual and collective scale. This includes safeguarding our international borders and protecting financial transactions, which is essential as technology rapidly advances and our world becomes more dependent on cyber infrastructure. Just last week, the Department of Homeland Security released a solicitation seeking information on commercially available live scan fingerprint systems for possible use by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Additionally, they are researching ways for quicker identification by developing tablet-based technologies that can capture biometrics at the scene of a crime. Biometric research done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST, dates back to the 1960s, starting with fingerprint identification technology the FBI used to support law enforcement. Today, NIST continues their research in developing uses and enhancing different types of biometric technologies, including fingerprinting, face and iris scanning, voice recognition, and DNA testing. Biometric technologies are often touted as a democratic approach to identify management because no language, gender, age, race, financial status, or literacy rates impedes their use. Because of this, many biometrics playing a major role in fixing the so-called identity gap many developing countries face. For example, India has implemented a robust biometric identification program with the hopes of reducing fraud and corruption, ensuring credible elections, and improving national security. Additionally, biometric supporters point to the consumer's convenience of using biometric technologies. Many ask, why must we continue to carry key fobs, remember passwords, and enter personal identification numbers when we can use uniquely personal physical patterns in the place of additional items? Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley are developing a biometric security that uses brain waves to replace passwords, calling them pass-throughs. That's pretty interesting. But with praise also comes concern, such as how do we ensure biometric data is secure and being used appropriately. My colleagues and I are looking forward to learning about the positive impacts biometric technologies might have in increasing convenience in our everyday lives and improving our personal and national security, while having an open discussion about policy implications and addressing the concerns that some might have. We have an excellent panel of witnesses ranging across industry, academia, and government to lead our discussion. I would like to extend my appreciation to each of our witnesses for taking the time and the effort to appear before us today. We look forward to your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Lipinski for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bouchon. I want to thank you and Chairman Massey for holding this joint hearing to examine the use of biometric technologies. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here. I just want to know first, who's James Bond here? Right now, biometric technologies are used mostly by federal, state, and local governments to identify criminals and to assure our national security. Most people equate biometrics with fingerprints. It's because fingerprints have been used for more than 100 years, and automated recognition systems have been commercially available since the 1970s. In fact, the FBI has 110 million fingerprint records. Department of Defense has 9.5 million. The Department of Homeland Security has 156 million fingerprints in their database. But the landscape for biometric technologies is changing, and other technologies are being rapidly deployed in other countries. For example, India is in the process of collecting biometric information for every single resident. They have already enrolled more than 300 million people, and they are not just collecting fingerprints, but also iris scans. Efforts such as these could help combat fraud and waste, but also raise significant civil liberties concerns. Advances in facial recognition are being driven largely by companies such as Facebook and Google, who are using facial recognition algorithms to tag people on social media. All of these technologies have their own advantages and disadvantages. For example, a suspect won't leave their iris scan behind at the scene of a crime as they would a fingerprint. But it appears that the characteristics of the iris remain more stable over a person's lifetime. The bottom line is there is enormous potential for these technologies, but there are also a number of research gaps. There are many questions and gaps of a scientific or technical nature. For example, as I mentioned earlier, it appears that the characteristics of the iris are fairly stable over time, but biometric technologies rely on the distinctiveness of an individual, and there's a need to build up our fundamental understanding of how biometric traits vary not only between people, but as an individual ages. There are also many research questions related to the social and cultural aspects of biometrics. As I'm sure we will hear today, a biometric system is only as good as the quality of data it collects. Even when a person is a willing provider of their biometric data, there's variation in the quality of the information, let alone when a person is non-compliant or they're actively trying to deceive the technology. Understanding how a person interacts with a biometric sensor and what impact social or cultural beliefs have on that interaction is key to obtaining quality data. For example, a person may be reluctant to touch a sensor out of a fear of germs, or their religious beliefs may not permit them to show their face in public. As my colleagues are well aware, I've been passionate about the need to secure cyberspace. I often comment on the fact that most people use a few passwords for all their online activities, from banking to streaming movies. We all know that using the same password is not what we should do, but we do it anyway just because it's easier. Unfortunately, that password can be forgotten, guessed, or stolen. Let me just say I don't use the same password. I don't want to suggest that and give anyone ideas. Biometric technologies hold the potential to significantly increase cybersecurity because it's much more difficult to steal someone's fingerprint or a scan of their iris, and you generally don't forget your finger at home, but these technologies are not widely deployed in the private sector. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is trying to address this through a national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace. But there's a lot of work to be done. Part of this is because most biometric systems cost too much for commercial applications, and there's no compelling business case for such an investment. Also, I, like most Americans, have some concerns about how the use of biometric technologies affects my privacy. I hope to ask the witnesses some questions about the security and privacy of biometric technologies later this morning. I'm especially interested in learning more about the sharing of biometric data and potential for secondary use of these technologies. Mr. Chairman, I believe the potential of biometric technologies to enhance our security is great and worth pursuing, but I also believe we need to make certain that there are appropriate safeguards in place so these technologies are not abused. Thank you again for holding this hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For the record, I don't use the same password for all my things either. Partially because of this type of stuff. Thank you, Dan, for those comments. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. It's now time to introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Charles Romine, the Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. ITL is one of 6 research laboratories within NIST and conducts research addressing measurement challenges in information technology as well as issues of information and software quality, integrity, and usability. ITL is also charged with leading the nation in using existing and emerging IT to help meet national priorities. Dr. Romine holds a BA in mathematics and a PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Virginia. Welcome. Our second witness is Mr. John Mears, a board member of the International Biometrics and Identification Association. He is currently the Senior Fellow for IT and Security Solutions at Lockheed Martin. Mr. Mears has worked on program performance, segment strategy, and technology plans for biometric identification and verification applications supporting the Homeland Security, defense, and law enforcement communities. He holds both bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Florida. Welcome. Our final witness is Dr. Stephanie Shakur, the director of the Center for Identification Technology Research, or CITER. She is currently a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computing Engineering at Clarkson University. Her research focuses on processing and interpreting signals which arise from the human body. Dr. Shakur received her doctorate degree in electrical engineering from the University of Michigan. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, after which members of the committee have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. Romine, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Buchan, Chairman Massey, Ranking Member Lipinski, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittees, I'm Chuck Romine, Director of the Information Technology Lab at NIST, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our role in standards and testing for biometrics. NIST has nearly 5 decades of experience improving human identification systems. NIST responds to government and market requirements for biometric standards by collaborating with federal agencies, academia, and industry to support development of biometric standards, conformance testing architectures and tools, research advanced biometric technologies, and develop metrics for standards and interoperability of electronic identities. NIST research provides state-of-the-art technology benchmarks and guidance to U.S. government and industry. To achieve this, NIST actively participates in federal biometric committees and national and international standards developing organizations. Biometric technologies can provide a means for recognizing individuals based on one or more physical or behavioral characteristics. These can be used to establish or verify personal identity of enrolled individuals. By statute, administration policy, NIST encourages and coordinates federal agency use of voluntary consensus standards and participation in the development of relevant standards, and promotes coordination between public and private sectors in the development of standards and conformity assessment activities. NIST collaborates with industry to develop a consensus standard that is used around the world to facilitate interoperable biometric data exchange. The standard is evolving to support law enforcement, homeland security, forensics, and disaster victim identification. Internationally, NIST leads development of biometric standards that have received widespread market acceptance. Use of these standards is mandatory by large international organizations for identification and verification of travelers at border crossings. In response to the Homeland Security Presidential Directive 12, NIST developed a standard to improve the identification and authentication of federal employees and contractors for access to federal facilities and IT systems. NIST is updating the standard and guidelines for iris and facial images and privacy-enhancing on-card comparison. NIST leads the development of conformance test suites for implementations of national and international biometric standards. At the request of DHS, NIST assisted with conformance testing for transportation worker identification credential specifications, resulting in TSA issuing a smart card with the worker's fingerprint for identity verification. To assist in qualifying products to TWIC specifications, 3 independent testing laboratories have been accredited by NIST, and card reader products from about 20 vendors have passed testing. Understanding capabilities and improving performance of biometric technologies requires a robust testing infrastructure. For more than a decade, NIST has been conducting large biometric technology challenge programs to motivate the global biometric community to dramatically improve the performance and interoperability of biometric systems, foster standards adoption and support global deployment, and achieve an order of magnitude better accuracy gains. NIST is also working to advance biometrics through the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or NSTIC, a White House initiative focused on catalyzing the private sector to create an identity ecosystem. 2 NSTIC pilots involve biometrics for authentication, one based on the use of a signature, a second based on smartphone voice and facial recognition. The NSTC National Biometrics Challenge 2011 report included a few key challenges to the future application of biometrics technologies, including research in the privacy and usability of biometrics. For privacy, NIST is collaborating to advance technical methods to safeguard and control the use of biometrics through methods such as liveness detection and biometric template protection. Usability is a priority for developing biometric systems within the federal government, for deploying biometric systems within the federal government. NIST was identified in a recent National Academies report as one of only 2 organizations addressing usability in biometric systems. NIST has applied its usability expertise to several studies involving biometric systems. Improve the collection process. In summary, NIST has a diverse portfolio of activities supporting our nation's biometric needs. With NIST's extensive experience and broad array of expertise, both in its laboratories and in its collaborations with U.S. industry and other government agencies, NIST is actively pursuing the standards and measurement research necessary to deploy interoperable, secure, reliable, and usable biometric systems. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on NIST's activities in biometrics, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize our next witness, Mr. Mears, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Bouchon, Chairman Massey, Ranking Member Lipinski, members of the committees, good morning and thank you for inviting the International Biometrics and Identification Association to this hearing. The IBIA is a nonprofit trade group that advocates and promotes the responsible use of technologies for managing human identity. As the committee is well aware, biometrics is not new, unproven, or radical. People have developed means throughout recorded history to uniquely identify themselves, starting with the first handprint signatures of authors of cave paintings on walls 31,000 years ago. In fact, I think it's an injustice that the first caveman wasn't given prior art credit by the Patent Office for what has evolved into modern hand geometry and palm print biometrics. And as a serious aside, I'd note that in the last week, the FBI has added a national palm print capability to its next generation identification system. My written testimony addresses the committee's questions in detail. In my oral comments this morning, I want to highlight some key points about biometric identification that do not always receive the attention they should. From an industry perspective, biometric technology is real and working today. There are successful U.S. government programs that prove this. For identification, IAFIS, NGI, U.S. Visit, DoD ABIS. For verification, HSPD-12 PIV, DoD CAC, TWIC. Biometrics have evolved from custom development to integration of commercial components. An example is the 1999 first implementation of IAFIS versus the 2013 version of next generation identification, which in large part uses COTS algorithms, commercial off-the-shelf algorithms. Biometric systems have improved sharply in accuracy. I can cite IAFIS at 92% versus NGI at 99.6% accuracy. Biometrics provide greater security and privacy than alternate means of identification, including IDs and passwords, which are vulnerable and becoming obsolete, as the chairman observed, and biographics, which are subject to error, spoofing, and identity theft. New applications will develop in the private sector, in healthcare and finance. And perhaps significantly, mobility and smart consumer devices will probably in large part drive the acceptance and the need for the security and convenience that biometrics provide. The common thread from 31,000 years ago is that it matters who I am, No matter the period of history, identifying ourselves is an important function, so much so and so much a part of our lives that we sometimes take it for granted. In practice, we identify ourselves by our biometrics, our biographics, and our behaviors, as illustrated in the figure 1, in my written testimony. A biometric is a measurable biological or anatomical and physiological or behavioral characteristic that can be used for automated recognition. The figure shows a sampling of biometric types, and we're all familiar with the most common of these since they include things like fingerprints, faces, irises, our voices, and DNA. There are, in fact, a number of others that are shown in the figure, including some that are emerging in future applications. The most useful of these exhibit permanence. They can be easily observed, measured, and automated, and the best ones are very discriminating to the individual and are hard to spoof or reproduce. Biometrics are descriptors that are assigned by others or that we attribute to ourselves, but can change over time as we live our lives. These include things like our names, our addresses, our public records, our social security numbers. Biographics are useful for identification, but are generally less accurate because they do change over time and can be publicly discovered and spoofed, for instance, in the case of identity theft. And public records sometimes contain errors that are problematic, for instance, name misspellings versus watch lists, or errors in credit reports, which actually has happened to me. Behaviors are descriptors of our actions over periods of time. Group behavior can be observed, for example, in postings and social networking sites, through online transactions, phone records, emails, and affiliations. Individual behavior includes such things as handwriting, composition style, keystroke dynamics, walking gait, and online behavior. Many of these individual behaviors can be difficult to capture and analyze at present, but are potentially very useful, particularly for logical and cybersecurity. In practice, many techniques for authentication and identification use a combination of descriptors of identity. However, if you have to single out one technique, biometrics are the most convenient, reliable, and secure means available today. Biometrics are by the definition personal for all of us. It matters who we are, both to ourselves and to the people with whom we have personal and transactional relationships. With the advancement of sensors and computing capability to digitally represent and process biometrics, our lives can be made more secure and more convenient on an individual level as well as for our society. Biometrics are proven and effective when managed properly. Thank you for your time and consideration today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize our final witness, Dr. Shakur, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify to you today. There is a need to establish a trusted relationship between individuals and between individuals and organizations in order to support e-commerce, worker and employer interactions, delivery of benefits, movement of individuals, social connections, and healthcare. As the other testimonies pointed out, there are many ways to establish a trusted relationship, and they can include what you have, like credit cards and passports, what you know, passwords, PINs, mother's maiden name, and who you are, biometrics, the topic today. Transactions in the past have primarily rested on what you have and what you know. The addition of biometrics adds another dimension of security. Emerging is the use of biometrics as part of authentication to support transactions over the internet, including mobile payments. With weaknesses in passwords alone, combining authentication with a biometric reduces the amount of private information that would need to be revealed repeatedly in order to reestablish a trusted relationship. Depending on the transaction, levels of trust can be created by combinations of different forms of authentication. This is supported by the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, NSTIC, and is included in my recommendations in my written testimony. More difficult for those who seek to destroy that trust through cybercrime, terrorism, and identity theft. Similarly, in our counterterrorism efforts, knowledge of the individual is a critical aspect in sorting out those minority of individuals who seek to do us harm, where biometrics is a critical tool in a large toolbox of ways to identify those individuals. To support these efforts, I highlight 2 recommendations from my written testimony. First recommendation, invest in fundamental research for enhancement of privacy within biometric systems and develop policies which encourage the inclusion of privacy-preserving techniques. As with other personal information, biometric information must be protected and remain confidential. One example of methods in the research community and in some of the commercial sector is something called template protection. This is where biometric matching is performed in an encrypted domain such that biometric information is not disclosed at any point. Another is liveness detection. This protects from the vulnerability when an attacker creates and uses an artificial biometric, James Bond. Continuous attention is required in order to stay one step ahead of those who seek to defeat those security mechanisms. Privacy and security are often spoken in terms of trade-offs, giving up privacy in order to achieve security. The research goal is to actually change the paradigm where we can look to maximize both privacy and security with some of these methods. Recommendation 2, invest in fundamental research challenges in biometrics through the cooperation of government, industry, and academia. Investment in fundamental research is needed to provide the foundation for biometrics in the future and includes such things as studying uniqueness and the permanence of biometrics traits that have been mentioned in some of the other comments. Other related recommendations in my written testimony have to do with enhancing data sharing to support research and increasing our cybersecurity workforce, including those who have expertise in biometric systems. As a unique structure for pursuing research, I'd like to highlight the Center for Identification Technology Research, CIDR, of which I am the director. CIDR is a national science foundation, industry, university, cooperative research center, and it focuses on biometrics. CIDR functions as a cooperative of industry, such as system integrators, technology providers, small businesses, and government organizations such as the FBI, DHS, and DoD. Projects are defined by faculty through interfacing with that community and integrating their research needs. Outcomes include creating workforce trained in the industry and government needs, but also promoting innovation through translation of research to commercial products and creating jobs. In summary, research, close collaboration between industry, government, academia, and investment in education will continue to make the United States the best in the world. In biometrics, this investment can reap benefits for improving our security in cyberspace, protecting our national security, and stimulating our economy as a leader in the technology of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I thank the witnesses for their testimony. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair at this point will open the round of questioning. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Just an overriding question for all three of the panelists. Why isn't biometric technology being more quickly integrated into our everyday lives? Is there a financial barrier, a security barrier, a privacy barrier? And if so, where do you think the bottleneck comes from? Does it come from research and development or application or deployment, or where that would be? Dr. Romine?
Yes, I'd like to take that. I think there are a number of possible reasons. One of the reasons for establishing the national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace is to try to catalyze greater adoption of identity management technologies, broadly speaking. And NSTIC, some of the grant activity goes to trying to explore the use of biometrics as part of that ecosystem. I think a lot of it also is the sort of maturity of the technology. So I think one of the roles that NIST has to play with industry is trying to advance the state of the art in a way that we get greater confidence.
One of the observations the industry would make is that we sometimes see quantum advancements in technology as a result of what we call a killer app. That is, there's a compelling application that's popular with masses of people, perhaps consumers, that drives adoption of a particular technology. We think that in the realm of mobility, the proliferation of smart devices, the drive for convenience and personalization of these devices, and the need to hold those devices securely will drive adoption of biometrics into consumer devices, which will drive volume and, in fact, drive acceptance generationally over to allow it to permeate other industries and applications.
I guess I would agree with the other two. I think it's looking to get that perfect storm. As many of us have, we have a fingerprint reader on our laptops. It doesn't do anything besides get us into the laptop. I think that's where the mobile devices come in. As we use our mobile devices as a form of payment, now there's a value associated with those mobile devices, and that's that killer app that we're talking about. And then it comes to the convenience of it. It's frustrating, as we talked about, to have to remember long, secure passwords, or we use simple passwords that we use in multiple places. By making the convenience of a simple swipe or a face on your mobile phone, that's where the demand comes, because you want your phone protected because it pays for things. An enabling thing is the NSTIC, National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. That provides that interoperability and standards such that when you do that authentication, it goes somewhere, and it gives you that process such that you have that secure transaction.
Thank you. I'm going to make an editorial comment, then I'm going to ask another question. I was in healthcare before this, and did a lot of, in my training and practice, trauma-related type things, and I can tell you at medical centers, the number of people who come in unidentified is fairly significant, and biometric technology would use in that application would be extremely helpful to identify people for family notification and other reasons. That said, is there one area that maybe all of you can comment on that you think that this could really revolutionize how we live our everyday lives? Is there a game-changing area that you think potentially that we should focus on first, maybe, or close, or a few that would really make a revolutionary change in the way we live our everyday lives? For example, in my view, online purchasing security or some other thing, and what ones maybe we're close to being able to apply broadly that would change people's lives. Dr. Ouma?
Well, I think you probably hit on one, which is that acceptance is going to be driven by providing added value to the customer, and the customer in this case is going to have to be sort of the American citizen, perhaps rather than government-only applications. For that, the usability of these systems is absolutely crucial. There has to be both a value added and a good customer experience that adds to the efficiency of the transaction, the effectiveness of the transaction, and satisfaction for the user.
I'm running out of time, so if you could be brief, Mr. Mears.
Okay, I'll just add on what I said before. The rumors in the industry are the Apple 5S iPhone is scheduled to come out this summer with a fingerprint reader. And we think this is going to be an enabling technology that allows that platform to do a number of different applications, and we think it'll launch from there once the platform's enabled by biometrics.
Dr. Shakur.
I agree with what the other two members have said that are testifying today. I think the killer app is the mobile payment system, and I think the driver is the customer who wants their phone to recognize them when they're holding it, essentially.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Lipinski for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What you were talking about here, I don't know if I should start going down this road, but let me quickly do it. And why have we not gotten there yet? I think most people feel like they would pay something extra. If I didn't have to remember all my passwords, I would pay something extra for that. If I could use a fingerprint, if I had, if I could go purchase something, plug it in the USB port, use my fingerprint, I get in. How come it hasn't happened yet up to this point? If anyone has a very brief answer to why to this, so we can move on. Mr. Mears?
One of the things I would observe is that many applications are kind of stovepiped. The applications that you next. And so there's no real uniform way of communicating between those. So it leads to this stovepipe approach that doesn't lend itself to what we look for as we call unitary logon, the convenience of having one logon with security, including biometrics, that gives you access to multiple different types of applications. In government services, the migration to the cloud computing, actually helps security and helps that convenience because it puts those apps within a cloud community that has structure that is amenable to unitary logon. And so you're going to see advancements as a result of that. But I think in short, that's the reason.
Okay, but if Apple comes out with this fingerprint reader on the new iPhone, how does that get past that issue?
Well, certainly for the apps that we all know and love on our mobile phones, it can be an enabler that will be accessed for those apps. My comment was more to the large IT systems that reside elsewhere, perhaps in government service. But for the app side of it, it will definitely drive convenience.
Okay, let me move on to, or Dr. Shakur, you want to add something quickly?
Well, I was just going to say the NSTIC is also creating this independent private identity broker, and through that brokerage, that can be your interface to all of those places where you need to provide that password. And so that's an enabler essentially to get at what you want. So the phone can provide it, but really you also need that broker who can say to this application, yes, that this is the right person to get access without giving all the information away, right? You authenticate with them like a PayPal, but an expanded sort of PayPal.
And how far are we away from that? Dr.
Maybe
Romine?
that would be appropriate.
Well, the NSTIC program is relatively new. The grants that have gone out are in their first year of full gear up. But I would say we're optimistic that the program, which is slated to be essentially a 5-year program, will actually catalyze a lot of what Dr. Shakur was talking about with regard to establishing that ecosystem that is interoperable with the pillars of privacy, transparency, usability, and so on as a driver. Thank
you. Another question, Dr. Shakur, you had talked about in your testimony that biometrics relies on uniqueness and permanence. You also state that much of the funding for biometrics is focused on near-term implementation challenges, and more research is needed to provide a foundation for biometrics. Can you describe the foundational research that's needed, and which biometric traits are more stable over time, which are more unique? How do you find that balance?
Yes, thank you. So we think of biometrics as all being equal. You hear people say, look, this is a biometric, X is a biometric, and really biometrics isn't that way because it has these two fundamental properties which you highlighted, uniqueness and permanence. And so uniqueness has to do with what's your ability to distinguish N individuals, and 1,000 individuals, 1,000,000 individuals. And so if we talk about the uniqueness aspects, we think of DNA as kind of one echelon. Then the next echelon would be finger, where 10 fingerprints is better able to distinguish people than one fingerprint. We look at iris. An iris would be equivalent to a fingerprint, 2 irises to multiple fingerprints. And then we have other levels of things like voice recognition and face recognition, and all the emerging biometrics. And so this is where the research is to understand what the capability sees you on a regular basis and you want to protect. You might not need 1 in a billion kind of accuracy. You may be satisfied with 1 in 1,000 because you get more convenience. The other aspect is the permanence, to do with, does the biometric vary over time? We all know our face varies over time. And so that's the other kind of study. So essentially, the biometrics are changing. We want diversity in the biometric market to look at different applications of biometrics, but we need to understand what its capabilities are so we can weigh them depending on the application.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Massey for his line of questioning.
So my first question deals with the possibility of mission creep here. When Social Security numbers were created, they were ostensibly to track retirement benefits, but now you need a Social Security number and need to provide it to purchase even health insurance. And there's been recent interest in using biometrics, I think, to curb immigration violations. But at some point, it seems as if we might need to provide proof of self to check out a library book or to rent a house or even just to attend a sporting event or log on to the internet. How is industry ameliorating these concerns, these privacy concerns right now? Mr. Mears, would you like to?
Yes, I'll address that. One of the things that we believe is that for every application, there must be a privacy policy if there's something related to personally identifiable information that's going to facilitate that application. It's got to be transparent, published. It's got to specify what data is taken, when, under what circumstances, with whom will it be shared, how long will it be retained, and in fact, there have to be sufficient hooks in the application such that you can verify that the application conforms to the policy, and in the best case, an independent ability to audit that the policy is implemented for that particular application. That's what we believe constitutes good privacy. And we'd like to see that across every application that requires the provision of personally identifiable information. And certainly the government does that now. We'd like to see that in industry as well.
So my concern comes when you take a new technology and it intersects a new piece of legislation. So for instance, in the House, we just passed the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, where private companies are now absolved of any liability in private contracts with their consumers if they share that information with the government. And so it seems to me as if this biometric information, once it's ones and zeros, it would be part of that shareable set of data. Dr. Shakur, do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I do agree that we need to treat a biometric just like we treat the other information about ourselves. And I think that we're grappling with this explosion of data about ourselves. It's not just biometric data. It's all the biographical data we're talking about, but it's also our movements, our shopping habits, where we've been. There is this explosion of data, and there's an explosion of data in the commercial sector. The government has limitations on what they can do with data, in particular biometric data. Where's the equivalent on the commercial side? And so I think that we're wrestling with this as a society. Biometric is one piece of information, but it's in the context of a lot of other information that is collected about us. And I do think that we need to, along the lines of the things you said, give the ownership of the data to the person such that they know what data is stored about them and where it's stored, and give them access to be able to pull data and to give them control. And that's where NSTIC can come into place, control of their own data as best we can.
So appreciate those comments. Speaking of control of your own data, outside of criminal investigations, where we've all heard of DNA being used, are there any industrial applications for DNA as an identifier? Yeah.
DNA application. Well,
it's kind of, as you mentioned,
right.
It's at the upper echelon. It doesn't change about a person over their lifespan.
Right. Yes.
It's a little more intrusive to perhaps collect than a facial recognition when you walk by a camera. But just can you give us an example of a DNA application outside of a criminal?
Well, I do think there's the positive claim aspects of it. So if a person wants to immigrate, suppose they have a familial relationship. This is an example of you're making a positive claim of a relationship. The DNA can confirm that claim in a way that's less hassle than trying to produce documents, than interviews and the other aspects of it. So that's not commercial. That's still government. So I was trying to struggle a little bit. I think you were asking commercial.
No, that's actually the sort of answer I was looking
Okay.
for. So it's a great answer.
Great.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
I now recognize Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Shakur, in your testimony, you mentioned a case where a woman from South Korea used a special tape on her fingers to spoof or fool a fingerprint recognition system at a Japanese airport. I can also imagine a scenario where someone else uses a photo or video to convince a camera that they are indeed the person associated with an access card. As I understand it, research into these vulnerabilities is termed liveness detection. Can you please describe how the research community is attempting to detect false or fake biometric traits, and how can we assure someone is who they claim to be when a biometric system is unattended?
Great, thank you. This is some research that I'm doing in my laboratory and also being done at the Center for Identification Technology Research. So essentially, we talked about what you know and what you have, and that biometrics is what you are, this kind of other dimension. But as all these other security mechanisms, it has vulnerabilities. And this is one of the vulnerabilities we need to be aware of. What we have to understand is if we're utilizing biometric in an application, there is a purpose for recognizing someone's identity in that application. And so does the biometric go towards improving the security that we need with the caveats that we talk about? So we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, essentially. I believe that the biometric information can be very useful for some applications because it's complementary to the other ways we identify people. That being said, we know it's a vulnerability, therefore we need to do research in that vulnerability. And that's one of the things we do in our laboratory. What we're interested in is I have a fake finger here if anybody wants to see it afterwards. We're interested in not faking, but what we're interested in is building those technologies that make it difficult for people to fake the biometric. The word liveness is about recognizing that biometric was measured at that time. So even if your face is not secret, knowing that I just took a picture of your face and that you're physically there at that time, that tells you that it's not a fake biometric. So that's the kind of research we need to do is to build those. You asked about what technologies are in place. There are software methods that can recognize when someone's faking a biometric. There are hardware methods, things that use light to recognize a finger, for example, as a real finger. And so those are the things that we need to continue to research and put in place.
Dr. Romine, what is NIST doing? What are their efforts in liveness detection?
To Dr. Shakur's to do research in this area.
That's great.
So,
thank you very much.
Great. You're quite welcome.
That's great.
We're also engaging, NIST is not currently conducting internally in our intramural program liveness detection research, although we understand, as Dr. Shakur's mentioned, this is a vulnerability that we need to pay attention to. We are engaging the international community in the standards arena around trying to develop standards for this kind of liveness detection or anti-spoofing. So that's the extent of our current activities, but we were pleased to be able to provide support to a top scientist.
Well, thank you. Dr. Romine, as you know, almost everyone has a smartphone. They have gone from devices used to call friends and family to being used to purchase coffee at Starbucks or deposit checks, which raises privacy and security concerns. In your testimony, you discussed several challenges, including compression and limited bandwidth communication channels that need to be addressed before biometrics can be fully implemented on mobile devices. Can you please speak to what you're doing at NIST to help address the use of mobile devices and privacy and security concerns?
Certainly. The use of biometrics is a very context-dependent thing, and the idea of accepting a certain vulnerability with the benefit that you accrue for using the biometric is sort of an individual choice. But one of the things that I would say that's very important is the idea of ensuring encryption is done whenever biometric data, or indeed any personally identifiable information, is transmitted through mobile devices. I think without using that kind of encryption or some other privacy-preserving technology, I think the vulnerability is considerably larger.
give you back the balance of my time, which is 0.
I now recognize Mr. Schweiker for his questioning. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have you ever wanted to start to engage in a conversation on something like this, but you're fearful you've watched too much sci-fi in the past? But let's actually jump down the line here. First off, fingerprint scanning technology is what, 2 generations ago? I mean, we may be still working on some of the protocols and the security and the mechanics, but I mean, we were playing around with that in the early 90s, if I remember one of my classes. So where are we at technology today? How good is facial body human recognition getting through a camera? Doctor, why don't we start down the right and work our way over? Where are we at right now? What's cutting edge today?
Thank you. So I think a lot of the things that we've brought up already are important. Even fingerprint, the issues are the scaling. You know, when you're looking at using fingerprints in large-scale applications, those are some of the challenges. Certainly the security and privacy side of a fingerprint.
But even outside some of the
Right.
challenge and the box we're in,
Right.
What is the most cutting-edge thing you hear that's on the horizon right now?
I think the one area that could be interesting is the mobile device knows you, right? So you want to say cutting edge. So this isn't available now, but you could see it in the near-term future as if we do investment in research, that you don't necessarily have to do something very deliberate for the mobile device to know who you are.
Okay.
And so I think that could be an area that we could invest in, and it makes it easy for people to authenticate.
Mr. Mears.
So if you're looking for cutting-edge technology, and I'd refer you to Figure 1 of my written testimony, there are a number of biometrics that are emerging, many of them out of biomedical research. But I'll give you an example of the evolving biometrics. One of them is scent, for example. We have all known for years that dogs track us based on our scent, which is genetically determined with a dietary overlay.
That explains a lot of things at home.
Well, wouldn't it be great if you could reduce that to a digital format and be able to reacquire that same scent in multiple sensors? Dogs can't communicate to each other once they communicate a scent. That's an example. Another one is standoff technologies in general, being able to acquire biometrics at a great distance for face, for iris, for fingerprints, for example, that have not normally been done at a distance.
Well, you're actually hitting to one. Back in December, I remember coming across an article that was saying that experiments to be able to read iris at a distance. True?
Yes, sir. Some of the commercial technology has been on the order of 2 meters standoff that's commonly available in our industry.
So literally I could be at a grocery store register and it would be able to...
Potentially, and that's commercially available today. There is research at Carnegie Mellon, for example, that's several tens of meters of research, and I've seen in the laboratory more than that, and I can't say more than that. But those are types of technologies for standoff iris.
Doctor, what's cutting edge out there? What's on the horizon?
Well, I would revisit Dr. Shakur's sort of hierarchy of different biometrics, and as you point out, fingerprints are widely understood, I think, or largely understood, DNA even more so. All of the biometrics technologies that range from fingerprints, iris, face recognition, even gait, how someone walks, how someone types, signatures, all of these things are improving as the technology improves, the capabilities of technology and computation improve.
Okay. Now in the private sector world, am I heading towards a time where I walk into my grocery store and I'm going to pay with cash because I don't want it on the database that I have a small Haagen-Dazs problem? And yet somehow my Haagen-Dazs problem gets attached to my file because I paid with cash, but it picked up my gait, it picked up my facial recognition, it picked up my iris. And where are we going now in that type of data using biometrics to attach to our personal data files that ultimately end up tagging the fact I have high cholesterol and my insurance rating? where are we right now in that interlinking?
So I think this is the challenging intersection between what the technology makes possible and what the policy apparatus makes permissible. And I think from NIST perspective at least, we focus entirely on the technology side, measuring the capability of the technology, providing testing infrastructure so that the community can improve its technology. The policy apparatus is going to get increasingly challenging, I think.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, but there does become sort of that future cascade effect of, particularly with healthcare and many of the other things out there, these attachments. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would agree with that, especially that, and the DNA analysis obviously is not an area that you could escape. That you might detect that somebody's going to get Huntington's chorea, for example, or some other thing that might identify them as being not insurable or other issues. So we've got challenges, but it's a very exciting field. At this point, I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we ask that you just respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much.